Chapter 3. "You look like you could use a spot of tea," came a voice from above. The voice was so familiar yet unexpected that it jolted Holly from her tears. "What?" she asked while unblocking and looking up. "I said, you look like you could use some tea," repeated the familiar voice. Holly rubbed the tears from her eyes and found herself looking up at the head of an elderly lady wearing curlers and a scarf. "Mrs. Figg," said Holly delightedly, recognizing the lady. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Figg was the caretaker at Hogwarts. Mrs. Figg took a step backwards in surprise, enabling Holly to get a better look at her. Her hair was done up in small sausage-sized curlers and covered over with a hairnet. There were a lot more lines in her face than Holly remembered. A faded patched scarf covered most of the curlers and was tied in a knot at her throat. She wore a faded blue flowered house dress and a worn gray cardigan that was buttoned together at the third button. Her white socks were rolled down to the ankles, showing pale, thin, bony legs beneath the skirt. Black, heavy Oxford shoes, scuffed and well worn, completed the attire. From one arm hung a string shopping bag that looked worn and patched. "What am I doing here?" Mrs. Figg repeated Holly's question in surprise. The shopping bag gently swung back and forth as she moved. "I live here," she answered, and Holly vaguely remembered someone had mentioned Mrs. Figg had once been a neighbor of Cousin Harry. "At least I do a couple blocks from here," she amended. "I have for over 30 years, Mrs. Figg added proudly. "But I don't remember you," she added, looking down at Holly with concern. "Have we met before? My memory is not as it used to be, but I'm sure I would have remembered if we had met before." "Sure we have," said Holly eagerly as she sat up. "While I was at Holly stopped, for Mrs. Figg had swiftly moved her free hand to cover Holly's mouth, stopping Holly from speaking. The shopping bag swung forward, also banging Holly in the shoulder and arm. There was something very heavy and solid inside. "Mustn't mention names, dear," Mrs. Figg said worriedly, looking all around her in fear. "Names are dangerous. Do you understand?" Only after Holly had nodded did Mrs. Figg cautiously remove her hand from Holly's lips. "Now," continued Mrs. Figg seriously, "did you say you would like some tea?" "I guess so. Yes, please," said Holly solemnly. "Good," replied Mrs. Figg happily. She offered Holly her free hand and helped her stand. Holly brushed the leaves and dirt from her legs. "My home is only a short walk from here," Mrs. Figg continued. "Why don't you come with me and we can continue our chat there? It's been ages since I've had any visitors." Mrs. Figg turned to leave, but Holly remained standing, staring at the place where the tree had been. "What is it, dear?" Mrs. Figg asked kindly, noting Holly's reluctance to move. "The tree," stated Holly. "What happened to it?" "The tree?" Mrs. Figg frowned, looking blankly down at the ground, finally noting the stump that Holly was staring at. "Oh, that tree," she replied knowingly. "Lightning struck it, or so they say. Such a storm as you never did see before. All kinds of lightning, green, red, gold, and on a clear night, too. If one didn't know better," she added in a whisper, "one would have thought there were people flying up there fighting away. But of course, that's not possible," concluded Mrs. Figg. And Holly, reading the emotions behind Mrs. Figg's words, realized that a fight, most likely between wizards, was exactly what had happened. "That's why we all decided it must be lightning," Mrs. Figg continued in a louder voice. "Anyway," she added conversationally, "one of those flashes of light struck the tree and it sort of exploded. Such a loud boom, too. I'd have thought a bomb had hit it. There wasn't much left of the tree when I saw it the next morning. Not much at all," she finished. Mrs. Figg regarded Holly thoughtfully as Holly stared mournfully at the tree stump. "It's just a tree, of course," she mused. "Though I seem to recall that he was rather distressed, too, when I told him about the tree." "He?" queried Holly, looking at Mrs. Figg for further explanation. Had someone else known what was there in the tree? "Mustn't mention that name," Mrs. Figg replied firmly. "That name can get you killed for sure." Holly knew better than to press. Mrs. Figg was convinced that identifying he was deadly. The very thought of it seemed to terrorize her. Holly looked behind Mrs. Figg to the house she and her parents had just left. It was still there, but it was covered in a warm, silvery, shimmery glow that was hard to see through. Everything within the garden wall, even the low rock wall, had the same pale, silvery glow. In front of the house, Holly noted a pillar of shimmering light. There were different wards surrounding the house and yards, but Holly thought she could go through them. "What are you doing?" asked Mrs. Figg, grabbing Holly's arm, stopping her from stepping back over the wall to investigate. "There's something I need to see first," replied Holly, struggling to break free of Mrs. Figg's hold. "No," insisted Mrs. Figg, grabbing still tighter. "That's bad luck, very bad luck." Mrs. Figg was dead serious. The fear oozed out of her. Holly stopped struggling. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, while staring intently at the shimmering pillar. It wasn't a pillar, not really. Holly could just barely recognize her dad within. He stood still like a statue frozen in time. One arm was outstretched, pointing towards the rock wall. It must have been that way after Holly had broken free to run to Vernon. The other arm was low and curled as if it were encircling Mum. But Mum wasn't there. Where was Mum? Like Vernon, Mum had vanished completely. "People are watching this lot," Mrs. Figg said nervously, looking about. "Always." She pulled Holly away from the brick wall. "You mustn't enter. You'll be seen. Besides," she added, "there's nothing there anyway. No reason to enter that lot." That was said with conviction, too. Holly looked at Mrs. Figg in amazement. Dad was in that lot. The house was still there, its huge shape clearly recognizable underneath the silver sheen. How could she say nothing was there? "What do you see?" Holly asked cautiously. Mrs. Figg turned her attention to the lot and stared at it intently. "Nothing." "Nothing?" asked Holly, dismayed, while staring at her dad. His outstretched arm seemed to beckon her. "Nothing at all?" "Dirt," amended Mrs. Figg, "and rocks." She leaned over and whispered in Holly's ear. "That's how you know it's bad luck," she added. "Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there, not even weeds." She tugged on Holly's arm, and Holly allowed Mrs. Figg to guide her down the sidewalk alongside of the lot. "How long has it been that way?" Holly asked, still staring at her dad longingly as they moved further away. "Ages," replied Mrs. Figg as they walked. She moved swiftly and kept a tight grip on Holly, forcing her to keep up. 20, maybe 25 years now," continued Mrs. Figg conversationally. "There used to be a family living there, with a huge, fine house, a neat lawn, and well-kept flower garden. I knew them quite well," she added as an aside. "What happened?" asked Holly. They had already moved past the rock wall and continued down the street on the sidewalk. Holly twisted her body and head to keep looking at her dad as they walked, trusting that Mrs. Figg wouldn't let her stumble or fall. It was getting harder and harder to see his figure. Finally, she couldn't see it at all. Holly longed to go back, but allowed Mrs. Figg to propel her forward instead. She could return to him later. "One day," said Mrs. Figg importantly, "they all vanished. The house, the family, everything, and all you could see was the dirt. There was a big to-do at the time, mind you. Nobody knew what had happened, and that empty lot really ruined the look of the neighborhood, not to mention property values." They reached a playground. It was empty of children. The swings were broken and trash lay everywhere. Mrs. Figg leaned over and whispered in Holly's ear, "I'm not sure, mind you, but I think everything all vanished on the very day that poor boy disappeared." Holly felt her whole body grow cold. She froze in place, forcing Mrs. Figg to stop too. "What boy?" Holly asked, fearing she already knew the answer. "Do you mean That name is definitely dangerous," interrupted Mrs. Figg before Holly could finish. "Even now. But he was some relative of theirs. He used to go to a very special school," she continued, "and one day he just went missing and was never seen again." Mrs. Figg gave Holly a firm shove, forcing her to move forward again. "It really isn't safe out here," she muttered worriedly. "Not safe at all." Holly's mind was in a whirl. She moved mechanically, not caring where they went. Mrs. Figg's words had dispelled any lingering doubts Holly may have had concerning what had happened. Not that she had had any. Holly realized, as soon as he vanished, that Vernon must have activated a time-reverse curse, no doubt placed on the tree by Tom Riddle over 20 years ago. Even now, Vernon would be sitting alone in the dark, tied securely to a chair, waiting to die. Without meaning to, Holly had managed to mess up his life again. She should have told him about the plaque, so he would have known better than to touch it. But Holly hadn't thought it necessary. No one thought a second such cursed object existed, or it would have been hunted out and destroyed. It was too late to do that now. Holly knew about the curse and the object causing it only because she had encountered them both her first year while at Hogwarts. Then her cousin Albus Potter had accidentally set the curse off, sending Holly into a nightmare world where Cousin Harry had died and Lord Voldemort ruled. Holly hadn't been affected by the curse. For some reason, she could still remember things before the curse took effect. That knowledge enabled her to do what was necessary to reverse the curse. They later decided that Albus Dumbledore had somehow protected her family when they took in Cousin Harry, and Dumbledore's protection was older and stronger than the curse. The experience had given Holly nightmares long afterwards. Though no one believed it possible, not even Holly, a part of Holly was convinced it could happen again. She coped by wearing Muggle street clothes at all times, including shoes, even when she slept. Cousin Harry reasoned Muggle items were less likely to be affected should Lord Voldemort take over the wizard world again. And, so she'd never feel so helpless again, she always wore. Holly slid her hand to her waist while they walked and tugged on the belt she had worn for over a year. Tucked securely within was a wand she had received during her last experience, a wand that had survived the return to the regular world. It was sure to stay with her and work in the nightmare world as well. Holly's fingers curled confidently over the end of the belt and felt nothing. It was gone. Holly stopped in her tracks and swiftly pulled the belt out all the way. Was there a hole? Had it slid out? "What's wrong?" inquired Mrs. Figg when Holly stopped. "It's gone," muttered Holly worriedly, looking all about. Perhaps it had fallen. "What's gone?" Mrs. Figg asked. "My wand," replied Holly in a panic. "It was here. It's supposed to be here with me. Maybe it dropped somehow," though there had clearly been no hole in either the belt or case. "Never mind, dear," replied Mrs. Figg calmly. "You're better off without it." "You don't understand," began Holly desperately. "It's special. It's supposed to stay with me." The belief that the wand would travel with her, whatever happened, had enabled her to sleep at nights. Even now, Holly clung to that belief, unwilling to let the reality of this nightmare world shatter it. "It's got to be here somewhere," she added frantically. Holly broke free of Mrs. Figg's grip, wheeling around to retrace her steps. "No," said Mrs. Figg as she swiftly grabbed Holly and pulled her back. Holly struggled desperately to escape, all the while crying, "I've got to find it! I've got to find it!" Mrs. Figg twisted Holly around so they were face to face. Holly responded by pounding on her chest. Mrs. Figg was surprisingly strong for an old lady, and Holly couldn't break free, even though she tried. "You don't understand," said Mrs. Figg loudly, interrupting Holly's flow of words. She held Holly firmly by the shoulders while she spoke. "Those things are dangerous," she began while looking directly into Holly's eyes, emphasizing the importance of her words. "They'll know if you use it. They can track you through them. They'll hunt you down. If you are caught with one in your possession, you could die." The force of Mrs. Figg's conviction overwhelmed Holly, leaving no room for doubt. Holly stopped her struggling and instead collapsed into Mrs. Figg in a flood of tears. "But what'll I do?" she wailed, clinging to Mrs. Figg. "What you will do," Mrs. Figg briskly replied, taking charge of the situation, "is have a cup of tea." She released her grip on Holly and put one arm around her in a comforting hug. "Everything always looks better after a cup of tea," she added confidently, while she again propelled Holly forward. Mrs. Figg guided Holly up a walkway through a neatly kept yard to a small, nondescript white cottage, which looked much like every other structure on the street. They stopped at the front door. Mrs. Figg rummaged about in her bag, finally pulling out a small key, which she inserted into the front door. She turned the key in the lock and then removed it, returning the key carefully to her bag. Using the same hand, Mrs. Figg opened the door. The aroma of cooked cabbage wafted out. "Come in," she encouraged. Without waiting for Holly to move, Mrs. Figg gently but firmly pushed Holly inside and closed the door behind them. "I hope you like cats," said Mrs. Figg cheerfully as she carefully locked the front door. Yes," replied Holly, a lump forming at her throat as she thought of her own sweet Sasha that was still somewhere in the other world. "That's good," continued Mrs. Figg as she proceeded to fasten the 10 other locks, bolts, and chains also attached to the door, "because I have 4 of them. All perfect dears," she added proudly while she worked. Holly took the opportunity to look around. All of the windows were covered with yellowing curtains, making the room dim. It took a while for Holly's eyes to adjust. The living room was simple and sparsely furnished, with a sofa, a few covered chairs, and a low coffee table. There was no television. The photos on the fireplace mantel portrayed cats. Holly didn't look around for long, because 4 furry shapes all left their resting places and came forward to greet her. "Ah," said Mrs. Figg delightedly, "I see, they've found you." The cats crowded around Holly, and she knelt to pet them. They weren't Sasha, but their familiar cat touch and soothing purrs surrounded Holly, making her feel much better. Sasha's purr used to help Holly block outside emotions, and the genuine happiness of these cats at her presence helped Holly momentarily to set aside her own problems. "It looks as if they've taken to you," observed Mrs. Figg warmly. "They are a very good judge of character." And Holly had the feeling she had just passed some sort of test. "The tortoiseshell is Poopsie," Mrs. Figg said, pointing to a large cat with yellow eyes that was happily turning circles, rubbing herself against Holly's knees. "And that one is Boots," she added, indicating a sleek black cat with white paws that was arching her back happily with Holly's every stroke. "The orange one on your lap is Tiger," she continued. Tiger had settled quickly on Holly's lap while purring loudly. "And the one in your arms," meaning an affectionate black and gray tabby, "is Prince." Holly smiled lovingly at all the cats, lost in their warmth. She knew all the names from Hogwarts. Maybe things weren't so different here after all. "Where's Snowball?" Holly suddenly asked, looking up at Mrs. Figg, and remembering the elegant, all-white, long-haired cat with deep blue eyes she had seen at Hogwarts. So lost in memories, Holly had forgotten Mrs. Figg had said there were only 4 cats. "Snowball's dead," said Mrs. Figg flatly. "Oh," said Holly sincerely, not knowing what else to say. She could feel Mrs. Figg's pain at recalling Snowball. "She died a few years ago," she added, looking at Holly oddly. "How did you know about her?" "No," Mrs. Figg continued quickly before Holly had a chance to speak. "Don't tell me. I don't think I should know. If people were to ask me something, I couldn't tell them anything if I don't know now, could I?" "No," whispered Holly softly. The silence between them seemed to shout louder than words. Mrs. Figg clearly knew Holly was more than just a casual stranger, but not what. Wanting to know more, but afraid to find out. Unfortunately, she could be right. "Some of the neighbors' grandkids were throwing stones," Mrs. Figg finally said, breaking the silence. "A lot of stones." "That's terrible," murmured Holly, burying her face in Prince. The Snowball of her world had always been a bit standoffish and loud, especially when the students weren't where they belonged, but she didn't deserve to be stoned. No cat did. "There was no point in complaining," continued Mrs. Figg matter-of-factly. "The father took the body and threw it in the dump, and then he told me he saw Snowball in town with a lady cat. Said Snowball had just run off. I pretended to believe him, of course. He's a member of security, and it wouldn't do to make him mad," she added. "But I knew different. My cats told me what really happened." All 4 cats growled softly, and Holly could feel the anger behind her words. "The father used to throw stones at cats when he was younger, too. That's why my cats only go out at night now, when the neighbors are asleep." "Oh," said Holly softly. "Security? What was that?" "My, where are our manners?" said Mrs. Figg suddenly. "We shouldn't let you sit on the floor." She reached down to help Holly up. Prince jumped out of Holly's arms to the floor. Tiger leaped lightly off Holly's lap, and the other cats scattered. "Have a seat," Mrs. Figg suggested, pointing to the sofa after Holly had stood. So Holly sat down on a paisley print sofa covered with all colors of cat hair. Tiger promptly returned to Holly's lap and began kneading her legs happily. Poopsie settled down on the sofa next to Holly, rolling on his back, asking for a belly rub, and the other cats curled up on different chairs in the room. "I've something to show you," Mrs. Figg said, moving to the coffee table in front of the sofa. It was covered with a stack of thick albums, each a different shape, with different colored covers, resting one on top of the other, 3 to 4 books deep. Selecting one on the top with a royal blue color, Mrs. Figg used her gray cardigan to wipe the dust and hairs off the book and opened it in front of Holly. "See," she said, pointing to a photo of a stately cat with long white hair. "That's Snowball. Wasn't he handsome?" Holly nodded solemnly. "And here's Prince and Tiger when they were kittens," she added, pointing to the other photos of cats on the page. "Weren't they cute?" Holly nodded again. And look at these, she directed, turning the page, revealing more photos of cats in various poses, each neatly labeled with a name and a year. In fact, why don't you just browse through the photos while I get the tea ready? Mrs. Figg suggested while moving briskly towards the other room, presumably the kitchen. Holly sighed and thumbed idly through the pages, rapidly finishing the album. She liked cats, but she had other things on her mind. She put that album back. Rather than dust off another album, Holly fished out a red one from the bottom of the stack and, shoving Tiger aside, set it on her lap. It was much older, and its cream-colored pages were brown on the edges and brittle with age. Holly started from the beginning, turning the pages carefully. There were more cat photos, each neatly labeled. Mittens, Princess, Puss, Tabby. There were lots of names and lots of photos. The color had faded with time, giving them all a washed-out appearance. Holly paused at a photo of a huge cat being held by a small boy. The caption read, "Baby, 1985. It was the unnamed boy that held her attention more than the cat he held. It was the first photo Holly had seen of something or someone other than a cat. So she studied it more closely. The boy looked small and thin compared to the cat, which was very big and fat. He looked very young, too, perhaps 4 or 5 years. He had black hair that stuck out and glasses that looked too big for his thin face. The huge, multicolored cat hung limply in his skinny arms, and he seemed to stagger under its weight. "Oh, my," said Mrs. Figg, looking over Holly's shoulder. She had entered with a tray of delicate-looking porcelain teacups decorated with a spray of some small pink flower and a huge matching teapot. She set the tray down on the top of the albums, not bothering to dust them off first. Then she reached out and pulled the photo with the boy out of the album. "I should probably get rid of this," she said thoughtfully, looking at the photo. "Why?" asked Holly curiously. She held out her hand in a mute appeal to look at the photo again. "Because of the boy, you see," she replied, handing the photo to Holly. "One shouldn't keep pictures of him around," she explained. Holly looked at the boy with renewed interest. He looked like an ordinary boy to her, rather skinny, but ordinary. "What's wrong with the boy?" she asked. "That's the one who went missing," Mrs. Figg explained in a hushed whisper. Holly looked up at Mrs. Figg with wide eyes, but stopped herself when she saw Mrs. Figg's finger go to her lips. She began again. "You mean the one from the school?" she asked, careful to not name names. Mrs. Figg nodded. "I used to babysit him all the time," she explained. Holly studied the photo again, trying to see a zigzaggy scar on the boy's forehead, but the photo was too faded. He looked like a stranger to her. "He was a very quiet boy, almost shy," Mrs. Figg reminisced while Holly looked. "Very polite, too, not like today's ruffians. Baby followed him home one day," she added, remembering. "He had to carry Baby all the way back to my house because she wouldn't come otherwise. I just happened to have my camera handy at the time. Baby looked so cute being carried like that. I don't think he liked cats too much, though," Mrs. Figg reflected, taking the photo back and looking at it again while she talked. "But he never seemed to mind looking at my photos." Mrs. Figg studied the photo silently while remembering, and then added, "Baby got hit by an auto a few days later and died. It's my only photo of Baby, and I hate to get rid of it," she said regretfully. "There's no name on it," commented Holly softly. "No one could recognize him from this," she said, handing the photo back to Mrs. Figg. "Perhaps," agreed Mrs. Figg thoughtfully. "But it doesn't hurt to be too safe either," she added decisively. "Maybe I could just cut off the boy's head and keep the rest of the photo," she mused, placing the photo in a pocket of her cardigan. "No one could ever recognize the hands." Holly looked away, not arguing. Mrs. Figg probably knew best, but cutting off the head in that photo felt somehow like killing the boy to her. Mrs. Figg looked at the tray of tea and the cups in front of them. "Well," she began cheerfully, "we'd best get to our tea before it gets cold." She started setting out the teacups. Holly watched in amazement as Mrs. Figg proceeded to lay out 6 cups and saucers on the coffee table. She decided against asking why. "Oh, I forgot the biscuits," Mrs. Figg added as she began to pour the still steaming tea into the cups. "Would you mind getting them for me?" "Okay," said Holly. She closed the album carefully and set it down on the sofa on the other side of Tiger. Then Holly got up and started towards the kitchen while Mrs. Figg kept up a steady chatter. You have no idea how lucky it was that I saw you this morning, she began. It was just chance that I was looking out the window when you were pounding on the ground. Holly stopped mid-stride. She turned and looked around the front room at the windows with their yellow, dusty curtains. Out these windows? She asked. The curtains looked like they hadn't been touched in years. No, of course not, replied Mrs. Figg kindly. The kitchen windows. You'll see when you get the biscuits. They're in a box on the table, I think. Holly nodded and walked to the kitchen. The kitchen was easy to find. A pot of cabbage soup simmered on the stove, and the strong scent filled the air. The room she headed towards was inviting and filled with light. Curtains must not be covering the kitchen windows. Mrs. Figg continued her narrative from the other room. If security had seen you like that, they'd have asked all sorts of awkward questions, she added loudly. And we wouldn't want that now, would we? No, indeed. Security, thought Holly as she entered the kitchen. That was the second time Mrs. Figg had used the word. What was that about? Holly found the table easily. It was set against the wall across from the sink. The small two-person table was covered with a brightly colored afghan as a tablecloth. The afghan had fat pink, orange, and green zigzag stripes, and was so large it hung down over the sides of the table, laying in folds on the floor. The stripes were not aligned parallel to the table. An orange stripe touched the floor at the wall and angled up in a diagonal, so the same stripe also covered the corner of the table. The afghan looked like it had been there for ages. Dust and cat hairs had gathered on the top, dimming the bright colors. More dirt, dust, and cat hairs lay on the folds, touching the floor. Next to the table on the floor sat 4 china blue saucers lined up neatly against the wall. Each saucer gleamed as if polished daily. A dusty vase with 4 plastic pink roses and 2 daisies, also covered in dust, adorned the table. 2 placemats lay on top of the afghan opposite 2 chairs. The red and blue plaid mat was covered with dust, as was the top of the chair next to it. The purple, blue, and gold placemat had bright colors reflecting daily use. A pair of bright red child's binoculars lay on top of it. There was no box of biscuits. Holly scanned the room for the biscuits, glancing out the kitchen window in passing. She froze and looked again outside the window. There was a huge tree blocking the view. Beyond it was a high fenced-in yard. She looked around for another window, but there was none. Mrs. Figg hadn't been lying, yet how could she have seen her at her dad's house from here? Holly studied the kitchen more closely. There must be something she was missing. The stove, the table, the icebox, and counters, with a few clean dishes drying in the dish rack, a deep litter box in the far corner, nothing looked odd or out of place. Holly's eyes returned to the dusty table. She surveyed it thoughtfully. The biscuits had never been on the table, or they would have left a clean mark of some sort. Was there another reason Mrs. Figg suggested she look there? The only thing of interest on the table was the binoculars. Holly picked them up and looked through them. They magnified the floor, showing all the dust bunnies that gathered in the corners, and showed the bark on the tree outside in greater detail. "You're using the wrong lens," said Mrs. Figg from behind her. Holly whirled around at the sound of the voice, almost dropping the binoculars in the process. Mrs. Figg reached out and fitted what looked like some matching red caps on the end of the binoculars. "Try them now," she suggested. Holly again looked through the binoculars. They again showed the dust bunnies, but when she looked up and out the window, she saw, not the tree and yard outside, but the outline of a house with a shimmering glow. Dad's house.